Hey there, today I'll be talking about the process of fermentation. Now, you might remember fermentation going back to your high school biology days, and a lot of us associate fermentation with the process of making beer or wine. But fermentation is actually so much more than that. Yes, we do use fermentation to make foods like bread, cheese, yogurt, alcoholic beverages, and my personal favorite, kombucha, which is a non-alcoholic fermented drink. And that's actually the reason why I wanted to make this video on fermentation. So this right here is my initial batch of kombucha. The black liquid we can see right there is just black tea with sugar, and then this additional layer you can see here that's kind of a slimy layer is what we call SCOBY, a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. Now, this isn't a video on how to make kombucha, but what I will be talking about is the process of fermentation through which these microbes here, this colony of microbes, will be fermenting the black tea and the sugar, generating what will then eventually be kombucha. Okay, so what is fermentation? It's the process, the chemical process for a cell to generate energy without having to use oxygen. It's the simplest way for a cell to generate energy. Now, you might remember the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell, generating energy through cellular respiration. But fermentation is a separate process to that. It actually evolved first. Early life didn't have mitochondria, nor did they have the structures necessary to undergo cellular respiration. So they had to use fermentation to generate energy. Now, fermentation only yields about 2 net ATP. For those who don't know, ATP is the way the cells store energy and use energy. You can think of it as the cell's currency, the dollar or their coin. So fermentation only yields 2 ATP, whereas cellular respiration can yield 30 to 32 ATP. So comparatively, it's not a lot, but fermentation is done generally in very strenuous conditions, and at those moments, it's very essential for those 2 ATP to be generated. Okay then, so that's fermentation. Then what's the first steps of fermentation? Well, its first step is very similar to that. It's actually the same first step of cellular respiration. I'm talking about glycolysis. Glycolysis is very simple. Glyco means sugar and lysis means breaking of. You take a glucose molecule, which is the main sugar cells use, and you break it into 2 pyruvate molecules. I'll be talking about pyruvate a little bit later. So that's the very gist of glycolysis. It occurs in the cytosol of the cell, and it's actually when you generate those 2 ATPs. However, it's a very complex, multi-step chemical reaction. Here's a diagram of the entire process of glycolysis, but I won't bore you with the details. I do, however, want you to focus on this one molecule, NAD+. NAD+ is actually an oxidizing agent. What that means is it's a chemical that really wants electrons. So it's going to pull electrons from other molecules for itself. In this case, NAD+ is oxidizing G3P, converting it into another molecule that will continue the chain of reaction for glycolysis to occur. If glycolysis keeps occurring, eventually all of the NAD+ will oxidize G3P and will convert into NADH, no longer functioning as an oxidizing agent. So then, what happens when all of the NAD+ is gone? Well, no more oxidation occurs, glycolysis stops, and the cell then dies. Well, that's not really what happens, because we know that cells continue on living. The reality is that after glycolysis, cellular respiration will regenerate that NAD+, so that glycolysis can keep on going. But we're not talking about cellular respiration. We're talking about fermentation. So how does fermentation regenerate that NAD+ that's needed for glycolysis? Remember, glycolysis is an important part of fermentation because it generates the energy for the cell. Well, after glycolysis, there's a series of chemical reactions that vary depending on the type of fermentation that will actually regenerate the NAD+. Today I will only be talking about 2 types of fermentation: alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. So alcohol fermentation is the one we're familiar with the most. We know that it's done by yeast, like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and we generate alcoholic beverages and we make bread from it. It's actually very simple. So after you generated that pyruvate through glycolysis, pyruvate will lose CO2 molecules converting into acetaldehyde. That CO2 is the very same CO2 that makes bread rise and actually gives beer its fuzz. So after you have acetaldehyde, acetaldehyde will work as an oxidizing agent for NADH, regenerating NAD+. Acetaldehyde itself is converted into ethanol, which is the main alcohol in alcoholic beverages. That's the final byproduct. Very straightforward. So then the other type of fermentation we have is lactic acid fermentation. We use lactic acid fermentation to make a wide range of products like yogurt, cheese, kimchi, sauerkraut, a lot more. As a matter of fact, our own cells are capable of lactic acid fermentation. When you're running or doing extraneous exercises, there's just not enough oxygen to go around to all of your cells. So your muscle cells will stop using oxygen and will stop using cellular respiration and will convert to fermentation to generate energy, generating lactic acid as a byproduct. This is essential so that other parts of the body can have oxygen and your muscles can still generate energy for the exercise. So lactic acid is actually simpler than alcohol fermentation because once the pyruvate molecule is generated after glycolysis, that very same pyruvate molecule is going to serve as an oxidizing agent for NADH, regenerating NAD+ for glycolysis, and the pyruvate itself is converted into lactate, which is the ionized version of lactic acid. Basically the same thing if you were confused. So those are the two types of main types of fermentation I want to talk about. Something very important and key to understand is that the cell uses fermentation as a means to generate energy. They don't care much about the byproduct. However, we as a species are very interested in that byproduct, and we've learned of ways to commercialize that process of fermentation to generate food products or pharmaceuticals. It's actually one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by fermentation. Very simple biochemical process that we're able to take advantage of, and actually anybody can do in their own home. Anybody can make yogurt, cheese, kimchi, sauerkraut, or kombucha in my case. In the case of kombucha, the fermentation that is being done by that SCOBY I talked about earlier is lactic acid fermentation, a very small bit of alcohol fermentation, and acetic acid fermentation. But the possibilities for this process are endless. Thank you.